The cellar door was open. That was the first wrong thing. Ziva Holt had latched it herself before sundown, the way she had every night for 11 years, ever since the fire that took Daniel and half of everything they had built together. She stood now at the edge of her porch in the cold Wyoming dark, nightgown brushing her ankles, shotgun heavy in both hands, listening to the sound coming from inside her barn. Not the usual creak of old timber. Not the wind dragging itself across the plains. Something breathing. Something big and something afraid. Before the story truly begins, think about this. There are moments when a single act of mercy sets off a chain of events that cannot be stopped. A door left open. A lie told to protect a stranger. A choice made in half a second that rewrites everything. Ziva Holt had no idea, when she stepped off that porch, that the boy she was about to find in her barn was carrying the only thing powerful enough to destroy the most dangerous man in Callum County. Would you have opened that barn door? Or walked back inside and bolted the lock? If you believe that courage sometimes looks like a woman in a nightgown holding a shotgun, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what city you are watching from. Now let the story begin. The town of Harlan, Wyoming sat at the far edge of a county that most maps forgot. 312 souls, give or take, scattered across clay-colored plains that ran flat and treeless in every direction until they hit the distant knife edge of the Wind River Range. In summer the grass grew waist-high and golden. In drought years, which had become most years, it cracked and curled at the edges like burning paper, and the horizon shimmered with heat mirages that looked like water and were not. Ziva Holt's ranch sat 2 miles south of Harlan's main road, at the end of a dirt track that the county grader had given up maintaining sometime before Daniel died. The house was small, 4 rooms, a covered porch that sagged slightly on the eastern corner, a root cellar, a tool shed, and a barn that was too large for one woman and not large enough for the grief she kept inside it. She was 41 years old. She had the kind of face that had once been soft and had slowly become something harder and more honest. The calluses on her palms had calluses. Her dark hair, once long, she kept cropped short because there was no one left to notice either way. The neighbors knew her as reliable and private. The feed store owner knew her as prompt with payment. The pastor at Harlan Grace knew her as someone who attended Christmas service and sat in the back pew and left without speaking to anyone. The people who had known Daniel, the real Daniel, not the story the town told about him, knew that Ziva had loved him with the kind of love that left no room for anything else, and that his death had not diminished that love. It had simply turned it inward, like a lamp pointed at a wall. The fire had happened on a Thursday in late October, 11 years ago. The official report said faulty wiring in the old irrigation pump shed. The pump shed sat on the northern pasture, 100 yards from the house, close enough to the main barn that the flames had jumped the gap before the volunteer brigade arrived from town. Daniel had gone out to investigate the smoke. He never came back. Ziva had rebuilt what she could. The northern pasture remained a black scar she had given up trying to restore. Every spring she seeded it. Every spring the ground refused. She had 3 horses left. One was old and arthritic. One was a good quarter horse she used for ranch work. The third was a gray mare named Celeste who had belonged to Daniel and who Ziva kept out of loyalty rather than utility. She had no hands. She had no foreman. She managed alone. This was the woman who heard the wrong sound coming from her barn on a Tuesday night in early September and who did not go back inside. She crossed the yard slowly, bare feet on cold dirt, the shotgun at low ready the way Daniel had taught her. The barn door was pushed inward, not broken, just pressed. Someone had lifted the latch from outside, which meant they had found the hidden catch, which meant they had been watching her long enough to know where it was. She stepped inside. The lantern she kept on the hook by the door was still there. She lit it with the matches from her breast pocket and raised it. What she saw stopped her mid-breath. A boy was crouched in the far corner of the largest stall, pressed against the boards, one arm thrown over the neck of the most magnificent horse she had ever seen in her life. The animal was dark bay, almost black in the low light, with a chest that could have belonged to a locomotive and legs that were long and clean and perfect. Even trembling with fear in a strange stall, it moved with the kind of innate authority that made everything around it look ordinary. The boy was 16 at most, wiry, hollow-cheeked, with mud dried in his hair and a cut above his left eyebrow that had clotted badly and needed cleaning. His shirt was torn at the collar. His boots were too big for him. He was shaking. He looked at Ziva the way a caught animal looks at a trap, not with aggression, but with the particular terror of something that has run out of options. She did not lower the shotgun. He did not speak. The horse turned its great dark head and looked at her with an eye that was calm and intelligent and old in a way that made no sense for an animal this young. Ziva said, "Who are you?" It was not a question. It was a door she was opening, and she was not sure yet which way it swung. He swallowed, tried to speak. The sound that came out was barely a word. "Link. My name is Link." The pounding came before she could answer him. 3 hard blows against the barn side wall, and then a man's voice from outside, rough and certain. "Lady, we know the boy's in there. Open up, or we come through." Ziva looked at the boy. He had gone rigid. His arm tightened on the horse's neck. His mouth was moving without sound. "Please, please don't." She looked at the wall the voice had come from. She looked back at the boy. Something old and stubborn moved in her chest, something that recognized tyranny by its knock. She walked to the side door, cracked it 2 inches, and spoke through the gap. "There is nobody here but me and my animals. You are trespassing on private property at 11 o'clock at night. You have until the count of 3 before I stop being polite." A silence. Then a different voice, lower and colder. "Brooks wants the boy and the horse. Hand them over, and nobody has a problem tonight." She did not hesitate. 1. Another pause. "Lady." 2. Boots shuffling in the dirt. Quiet muttering. She did not reach 3. She simply held the silence long enough that it became its own answer. After a moment, she heard them withdraw, not far, but back to the road. She could see the sweep of a truck's headlights turning on the far side of her fence line. They were not gone. They were waiting. She went back to the boy. He needed to start talking. She brought him into the kitchen the way you bring in a stray dog, not unkindly, but with a clear understanding of who was in charge. She set the lantern on the table and told him to sit. She filled a basin with water from the hand pump and brought out the iodine tin and the cloth strips she kept in the drawer beside the stove. She was not gentle exactly. She was efficient in a way that happened to involve care. He sat still for the cleaning of his cuts. He flinched once when she pressed the cloth against the gash above his eye, and then he went somewhere inside himself and let her work. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she always left on low heat. She put one in front of him and sat across the table and waited. The wind pressed against the kitchen window. Outside, the truck was still there. She could feel it. "Start from where it makes sense," she said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He stared at the surface of the coffee. "My dad's name was Ray Calder. He worked for Harlan Basin Mining. That's one of Brooks' companies." She knew the name. Everybody in the county knew the name. Preston Brooks. Born in Harlan, left at 18 with nothing, came back at 40 with enough money to buy 3 ranches, the grain elevator, and half the seats on the county commission. He ran the largest private landholding in the region and controlled water rights on 4 of the 7 creeks that fed the smaller ranches. He was the kind of man who smiled in church on Sunday and ruined someone on Monday and slept fine either way. "My dad was a maquinista," Link said. "A pump operator. He worked the extraction wells on the North Basin." He stopped. His jaw worked. 3 years ago, he started noticing things. The well samples. The chemical readings were wrong. Levels of sodium and barium and something else he couldn't pronounce coming back way too high. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. He knew what the aquifer fed. All the small ranches on the south and west sides of the county pull their water from the same deep table. If that table was contaminated, the cup trembled in his hands. He set it down. He saved everything. Every printout, every log sheet, every report the company told him to falsify and sign. He hid them because he didn't know what else to do with them yet. He was trying to figure out who to take them to. She already knew where this was going. She had known from the moment the cold thing in her chest had started moving. 6 months ago, they killed him. They called it a machinery accident, a cable that snapped at the wrong moment. But Link's father had told him 2 weeks before that he was afraid, that someone at the company had noticed him asking questions, and that he needed Link to know where the documents were hidden. He hid them under the saddle of Zephyr, Link said. That was the horse's name. Zephyr. She said nothing. Link looked up. Mr. Brooks keeps Zephyr in the company stable as a show horse. Buys and sells horses for the image of it. The big-time rancher who breeds champions. But Zephyr isn't his in any real way. Zephyr was the one thing my dad talked about like it was his own. He used to groom him on Sundays when nobody was watching. He said the horse had a good soul. The word soul, coming from a 16-year-old boy about a horse, sitting in her kitchen at midnight, did something to Ziva that she did not allow to show on her face. So you went for the horse. I went for the documents. Zephyr was the only way to get them out without being searched. And he stopped again. He looked at her steadily. And the horse came with me. I opened the stall and he walked right out. Like he was waiting. She considered this. You've been riding since you were small. Since I could walk. My dad taught me. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the dark line of the fence and the faint glow of the truck lights beyond it. 2 men, she estimated. Maybe 3. Not enough to rush the house tonight. Brooks was calculating, not impulsive. He would send more in the morning if she didn't cooperate. How old are you? 16. Where's your mother? He looked at the table. She left when I was 9. She did not say she was sorry. The word felt too small for everything this boy was sitting inside. She said, "Are you telling me the truth?" He met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze for a long moment. She had spent 11 years reading silence and learning when it lied. It was not lying now. She took the iodine tin off the table and put it back in the drawer. "Then you sleep on the couch tonight. And in the morning we look at what your father left behind." He stared at her like she had said something in a language he did not expect her to speak. "Why? You don't know me. Those men outside." She cut him off. "I know the kind of men they work for." "That's enough." She turned off the overhead light and left him the lantern. Outside, the truck idled at the fence. Waiting. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and let her hands stop trembling. In the gray hour before dawn, when the sky had not yet decided between black and blue, Ziva went out to the barn alone. Zephyr was awake. He stood square in the stall, facing the door, and he watched her come with an attention that made her feel assessed rather than observed. She moved slowly, the way Daniel had taught her. No sudden gestures, no performance of calm, just actual quietness, the real kind that came from the body, not the mind. She put her hand on his neck. He let her. The saddle had been set against the far wall, still cinched from the night's hard riding. It was a beautiful piece of work, heavyweight cutting leather, hand-tooled along the skirt, the kind of saddle that cost more than some people's trucks. She lifted it and carried it to the center of the barn floor and laid it down. She had saddled and unsaddled horses for 30 years. She knew every seam and every bulge of every piece of tack she owned. She ran her hands along the underside of the seat, along the pommel, down the rear jockeys. And then, under the right side skirt, where the leather was doubled back and stitched in a pattern that looked decorative from a distance, her fingers found the edge of something that was not leather. A thin panel, held by 4 small brass screws, the heads worn smooth from years of pressure, but still intact. Hidden so well that you would not find it unless you were looking, and you would not look unless you knew. She went to the tool bench and found a flathead screwdriver. Her hands were steady. The panel came away. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth and then sealed in a heavy-gauge plastic bag, was a brick of papers. Lab reports on printed forms. Handwritten log sheets in neat, careful print. Chemical analysis tables. Photocopies of internal memos with subject lines that made her stomach tighten. And at the bottom, a folded letter in personal handwriting, addressed to nobody in particular and therefore to whoever found it first. She carried everything to the workbench and spread the pages under the lantern. She did not hurry. She read the way she did everything, completely, without looking for what she wanted to find, letting the information arrive in its own shape. The lab reports were from a certified environmental testing company in Casper. 3 separate series of tests, 6 months apart, covering groundwater samples from 14 collection points across the county's southern aquifer. The numbers told a story in the language of chemistry. Contamination gradients moving from the North Basin extraction sites outward, following the underground water table southwest toward the smaller ranch's barium. Sodium chloride in excess. Something the reports called NORM, naturally occurring radioactive material, disturbed and redistributed by the extraction process, leaching into the water table with each pumping cycle. It was not natural, it was not accidental, and it was not recent. The first series of tests was dated 14 years ago, 2 years before the fire that killed Daniel. She set the first report down. She picked up the second. The contamination gradient map on page 4 showed the affected properties shaded in gray. She looked at the western edge of the map, where the small ranches clustered along the base of the county's oldest creek bed. She looked for a long time. Her property was on the map, shaded the same gray as the others. She set the second report down. She picked up the internal memos. The subject line on the top one read, Holt Property, Noncompliance. The memo was addressed from the office of the County Land Acquisitions Manager, a man named Ferris who had since retired to Phoenix. To P. Brooks' personal file. The text was businesslike and brief. It noted that the Holt Ranch had declined a third purchase offer. It noted that the current situation could not remain unresolved given the proximity to the extraction grid. It recommended accelerated timeline on alternative methods. The date was 12 days before the fire. Alternative methods. Ziva's hand was flat on the workbench. Not gripping, just flat. Very still, the way you hold yourself when the thing inside you is large enough to break things and you have decided not to let it. 11 years she had believed in faulty wiring. 11 years she had walked past that black northern pasture and grieved privately and blamed the old pump shed and sometimes, in the worst hours of the worst nights, blamed Daniel for going out to check when he should have stayed inside, which she knew was not fair and could not stop thinking anyway. None of it was true. All of it had been manufactured. Daniel had died because Preston Brooks wanted this land and Daniel had refused to sell it. She stood in the barn for a very long time. Zephyr shifted in his stall. She heard Link's boots on the barn floor before she heard him speak. The boy was light on his feet, moving with the careful habit of someone who had learned not to make noise. He stopped when he saw her face. He did not ask if she was all right. He was smart enough to see that she wasn't and wise enough to know the question would be insulting. He looked at the papers spread across the workbench. She said, "Your father was thorough." Link nodded slowly. She said, "My property is on these maps." His jaw tightened. She could see him calculating whether he had known this before and said nothing. She could see him decide that honesty was the only currency that worked with her. "I didn't know that until now," he said. "I knew the maps were there. I didn't read them." She believed him. She began refolding the papers with deliberate care. "These go back in the oilcloth," she said, "and you do not let them out of your sight. Not for any reason." He crossed the floor and helped her without being asked, smoothing each page before she folded it. "Handling the reports the way you handle something you understand is valuable," she said, almost to herself. "He died for these papers. Your father too." Link did not respond. The silence was its own kind of answer. She sealed the plastic bag. She pressed the oilcloth around it tight. She looked at the boy who had carried her husband's murder through a Wyoming night in a hidden compartment under a stolen saddle, and she felt the shape of what she had to do shift from something uncertain into something clear. These were not just evidence of environmental crimes. They were the proof of 2 murders. And they would stay evidence only as long as Link stayed alive. Brooks already knew the boy was here, which meant the morning would bring something worse than a truck at the fence line. Sheriff Dale Clancy was not a cowardly man. That was the hardest part of it. He arrived at 9 in the morning in his county vehicle, alone, which told Ziva he had not come officially. He parked out front and climbed the porch steps with his hat in his hands. And that gesture, the hat off before he even knocked, told her everything she needed to know about how the next 10 minutes would go. She opened the door before he could knock. He looked at her face and then looked away, out at the plains. "You know why I'm here," he said. She stood in the doorframe and did not invite him in. "He's still here, isn't he?" Link called her. She said nothing. Clancy exhaled. He was 53, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that looked reliable and usually was. He had been sheriff for 9 years. He had helped her the winter the water main cracked, had driven out personally when she called about the fence line dispute with her eastern neighbor, had sent a deputy on Christmas Eve when she thought she heard something in the equipment shed. He was a decent man operating inside a system that Preston Brooks had quietly built walls around. "Ziva," he said. His voice dropped. "I need you to listen to me." She crossed her arms. "Brooks knows the papers exist. He's known it since Ray Calder started getting nervous. He's been waiting to see where the boy would go." He paused. "I can't protect you if you hold that child here. What you've got against Brooks is..." He stopped. "I can't act on it. You understand what I'm telling you? My office, my deputies, the county judge, it all runs through the same set of relationships. I'm not saying that's right. I'm telling you how it is." She said, "What exactly are you asking me to do?" He turned the hat in his hands. "Give me the boy. I'll hold him at the station. The horse goes back to Brooks' stable. The papers." He stopped again. "The papers," she repeated. His jaw worked. She studied him. "You already know what's in those papers," she said. "Or you have a good idea." He didn't deny it. She said, "And you're here asking me to hand over the only witness and the only evidence so that Brooks can make both of them disappear and you can go back to not knowing things." Clancy looked at her then. She could see what it cost him. He said, "If you don't give him something to work with, he will burn everything you have." He has done it before. And the back of her neck went cold, because he had just told her something he had not meant to tell her. He said it has done it before. Not, the county has seen this kind of dispute before. Not, powerful men will go to extremes. He, Brooks, specifically, had burned things before. She saw in Clancy's face the moment he realized what he had said. He looked down at his hat. She stepped back from the door. She said, "Get off my land, Dale." His shoulders dropped. "Ziva," she said, "now?" He put his hat on. He walked back to his truck without turning around. She stood in the doorframe and watched him go, and she kept her face still until the county vehicle had turned off the dirt road and the dust had settled behind it. Then she went back inside to the kitchen where Link was sitting at the table. He had heard everything through the open window. He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite hope and not quite fear, something that was the suspended moment between the two. She said, "They're coming this afternoon." He nodded. She said, "We need options." She went to the pantry and pulled out the old emergency radio from the second shelf. It was a CB with a shortwave attachment that Daniel had bought from an Army surplus catalog 20 years ago. She plugged it in and checked the charge. Then she went to the window and looked out at the plains. The grass was dry, had been dry for 2 months. The wind was coming from the north, steady and predictable. She thought about the maps and the oilcloth. She thought about the chemical gradients moving southwest. She thought about the 14 ranches shaded gray, and how many of those ranches still had owners who didn't know why their water had gone bad, why their animals had gotten sick, why they had ended up selling at a loss to Brooks Land Company in the years that followed. She thought about her husband walking across the dark northern pasture toward a fire that had been set to kill him. She went back to the table. She said, "Whatever happens today, we don't give them those papers." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Do you ride well?" He almost smiled. It was the saddest almost smile she had ever seen. "My dad taught me," he said. "Zephyr trusts me." She said, "Good. Because this afternoon we are going to need a horse that is faster than a truck." Outside, somewhere on the northern horizon, the smell of smoke was just beginning to arrive at the edge of the wind. Not yet, but coming. It started at the fence line. She saw the first column of smoke from the kitchen window at 2:30. A dirty brown smear rising from the northeast corner of the property, where the dry grass ran right up to the old split rail fence her grandfather had built and Daniel had repaired, and she had never found time to replace. By the time she was out the door, the column was thicker and the wind was helping it move. Link was at her heels. They stood in the yard and watched the smoke turn black. "Cocktails," Link said. "They're throwing torches into the grass." She had already understood this. She had understood it since Clancy's slip of the tongue. He has done it before, because the thing about a man like Brooks was that he had a method, and his method had worked before, and men who have succeeded with a method trust it. She ran back to the tool shed, grabbed 2 gunny sacks, and threw one to Link. She pointed to the rainwater barrel on the east side of the barn. "Soak them," she said, "and fill every bucket we have." He moved without hesitation. She went to the irrigation control box at the side of the house. Daniel had built a gravity-fed system from the high tank on the ridge, a relic of better-funded years that she had maintained against the day she needed it. She cranked the valve open as far as it would go and listened to the water begin moving through the underground channels that ran to the pasture perimeter. The irrigation channels were not enough. She knew that, but they would slow the fire at the southern edge and buy time. The smoke was thicker now, and the wind was pushing it toward the barn. She could hear Zephyr inside, not screaming. He was too composed for that, but his hooves on the stall boards made a tight, rhythmic sound. Controlled. Barely. She ran to the barn, opened the big double doors and the side window, let the air cross through. Zephyr's dark eyes found her across the space, and something in his posture changed. Not calmed, exactly, but deliberate, the way a trained athlete goes still before a race. Link was back with the soaked gunny sacks and 2 sloshing buckets. They worked the southern perimeter first, beating at the fingers of flame that the wind pushed ahead of the main fire line. The grass was so dry it caught from just the heat of proximity. She could feel the crackle and pop through the soles of her boots, could feel the temperature of the air change as the fire found the main pasture on the eastern side and began to run. The house was not in immediate danger. The fire was eating the perimeter pastures, the open land, the fence lines, the dry creek bed. But the barn was closer to the eastern edge, and if the fire jumped the small gap between the easternmost gate and the barn's wooden wall, she made herself not finish the thought. They worked. Sweat soaked through her shirt in minutes. The smoke was low and mean, the kind that got into your eyes and throat and made you feel like you were drowning vertically. Link worked beside her without needing instruction, reading the fire the way he must have read terrain while riding, anticipating where it would go, cutting it off. He had good instincts. She noticed this even through the fog of exhaustion and urgency. 30 minutes into it, the smoke on the western side thickened in a way that told her men on horses or trucks had extended the fire to a second origin point. They were encircling, not just burning the northeastern grass, building a perimeter of fire that would eventually close in from 3 sides and leave only the south, which was where the road was, which was where Brooks would be waiting. She pulled Link back from the eastern edge. She said, "They're boxing us in." He already knew. She could see it in his face. She said, "We can't put this out. There's not enough water and the wind is wrong." He looked at the barn. "Zephyr," he said. She nodded. "We go now, or we don't go at all." His jaw set. The boy who had been trembling in her barn 12 hours ago was gone. This one standing in the smoke and the heat had something else in his face, something that had always been there, she suspected, but that only this particular pressure had brought to the surface. He said, "I'll saddle Zephyr." She said, "I'll get Maple, her old quarter horse. Not fast, not young, but she was sound and she was brave and she had run through worse weather than smoke." She said, "The documents go under your shirt, against your skin, not in the saddlebag." He was already moving. She went to the house, to the radio on the kitchen counter. She had been thinking about this since this morning, since Clancy's truck had pulled away, since she had looked at the radio and understood what Daniel had bought it for. Not emergencies in the barn, not fence line disputes. For a day exactly like this one, she turned it on. She tuned it to the frequency she had listened to for 11 years without ever transmitting, 93.7, the Harlan Community Radio frequency. Elma Briggs ran the morning show from her kitchen, 2 miles north. She was there every morning, 7 to 11, reading weather reports and local notices and the occasional hymn. And at 2 in the afternoon, she put on recorded programming and left the board open. Ziva pressed transmit. She said, "This is Ziva Holt. I'm transmitting on open air from my ranch south of Harlan. My property is currently being burned by men hired by Preston Brooks. I want the county to know why." She set the radio on the table and let it transmit. She began to read aloud. She read from the lab reports. She read the dates. She read the property names from the contamination maps. She read the memo about the Holt property and the alternative methods. She read the date, 12 days before the fire that killed her husband. She said her husband's name out loud, which was something she had not done in a very long time, and her voice held. She read for 4 minutes. Then she set the reports back on the table and said, "If you are hearing this, I am asking for help." She clicked the radio off, picked up the reports, tucked them with the rest of the documents into the oilcloth, resealed it, and walked back to the barn through smoke that was now thick enough to make the midday sky look like dusk. Link had both horses ready. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Let's go." She opened the barn doors wide, and they came out into hell. The eastern pasture was fully involved, a rolling wall of orange and black that had eaten the fence line and was moving toward the barn's far side with the unstoppable patience of a thing that did not need to hurry. The smoke was everywhere, directional, and then not, shifting as the fire created its own wind. She could hear the fire from inside it, a deep, continuous roar punctuated by the crack of fence posts and the wet-sounding pop of greenwood inside the dry. Maple rolled her eyes but held. Zephyr was different. He moved forward, into the smoke, as if reading something in it that the other horses could not. Ziva pointed south. They rode. The gap in the fire line was narrow and closing. She could feel the heat against her left arm as they moved through it, a wall of air that went from breathable to scorching in the space of 10 yards. And then they were through, into the gray light of the south road, and she pulled Maple up and looked behind her. The barn was still standing. The house was still standing. They kept moving. They hit the main road, the county blacktop that ran east-west through the county's center, and turned east toward Harlan. They were 200 yards down the road when she heard the trucks, 2 of them, from the west, coming fast, and then a third emerging from behind the burning tree line to the north, cutting through a field access road in a plume of dust. Men on horseback flanking the trucks on the right side, 4 riders, spread out, moving to cut off the road ahead. Brooks had planned for this. She looked at Link. He was already moving, already asking Zephyr for more, and the horse responded in a way that made her understand why he was worth what he was worth. Zephyr did not accelerate the way normal horses accelerated, by increments, building through the gears. He simply went, full extension, full power, from a canter to a dead run in 3 strides, the ground moving under him in a blur. She pushed Maple, and the good mare gave everything she had, which was more than Ziva had asked of her in years. They ran east. The trucks came on behind them. She could hear the engine note change as the drivers pushed harder. A shot, a single crack above the wind, and then a shout she couldn't make out. They were warning shots or they were bad aim. Either way, she did not turn around. Zephyr pulled ahead. Link rode with his whole body, low over the horse's neck, the reins loose in a way that looked careless and was not. He was giving the horse his head, trusting the animal's judgment on the ground, and Zephyr justified the trust with every stride. The county bridge appeared ahead, the old Tulane crossing over the dry bed of Callum Creek. One way in, one way out, stone abutments on both sides. A natural bottleneck. She saw the vehicles already parked at the far end. Brooks had thought of the bridge too. She pulled Maple to a hard stop 20 yards short. Link brought Zephyr around beside her. The trucks from behind were slowing now, spreading out to cut off any retreat. The riders had fanned out along the road's edge. And at the bridge, a single figure stood in front of 2 vehicles with its engine running. Not a hired hand, not a foreman. Preston Brooks himself. He was not a tall man. He was built the way certain old things are built, compactly, without waste, with the particular density of something that has compressed under pressure over a long time. He wore his ranch clothes the way other men wore suits, with the consciousness of presentation. He had the kind of face that photographed well and trusted no one. He had a pistol at his hip, one hand resting near it, not drawing, not yet. He smiled. He said, "Ziva, I've always respected your stubbornness. This is not the moment for it." She sat on Maple and did not answer. He said, "The boy has property belonging to me. Papers that were stolen from a company facility by a disgruntled employee who then suffered a tragic accident." Tragic, she said. That was a word choice. His smile did not change. He said, "Nobody is going to listen to a widow and an orphan. You understand that. Whatever you think those papers prove, courts don't move fast in this county. Judges have full dockets. And in the meantime, accidents continue to happen." She said, "I know about mine." Something moved in his face. Just for a moment. The smile held, but the thing behind it shifted. She said, 12 days before the fire that killed my husband, your land manager wrote a memo recommending accelerated alternative methods for the whole property. I read it aloud this morning on the 93.7 frequency." He stared at her. She said, "I left the radio on transmit for 4 minutes before I came out here. Every farmer in this county with a radio on in his kitchen this afternoon heard those lab reports read aloud. Every property name on those contamination maps. Every date." His jaw tightened for the first time. She said, "Including the Drummond Ranch, and the Abilene place, and the Vasquez family on the North Creek." She watched him understand. She watched him understand that those were not just names on a map. Those were families who had sold to his land company at a loss and never understood why their water had gone bad first. Those were people who had thought it was nature, drought, bad luck, the plain hard difficulty of Wyoming, when it had been chemistry and intention and murder. Those were people with trucks. The sound came from the east first. She heard it before she saw it. The rumble of engines, multiple, coming from the Harlan direction, and then from the south, more. And from a farm access road on the north side of the bridge, a long bed water tanker, the kind the county volunteer fire brigade used, pulling into view. They came in a procession that felt almost impossibly large for this flat, empty county. Pickup trucks, most of them, old and dented and driven by people who had been listening to their kitchen radios on a Tuesday afternoon and had understood, within minutes, that the smoke on the horizon was not an accident. The Drummond family, the Abilene sons, 3 of them, the Vasquez family, mother and 2 adult daughters, a dozen other ranchers whose names Ziva knew and whose water she had never connected to her own story until this morning. And behind them, again, the county sheriff's vehicle. Clancy parked at the edge of the crowd and sat in his truck for a moment. She watched him. He got out. He put his hat on. He walked to the front of the crowd, past the neighbors, past the pickup trucks, through the space between the people who had come and the man who had burned their water and their land and 2 of their people. He stopped in front of Brooks. He said, "Preston." Put the gun on the hood of the vehicle. Brooks looked at him, then at the crowd, then at Ziva. He said, "You are making an enormous mistake, Dale." Clancy said, "Put it on the hood." A long pause. Brooks set the pistol on the hood. Clancy reached into his jacket pocket and produced a set of handcuffs that he had probably carried for 9 years without using them on anyone who mattered. He said, "Preston Brooks, I'm arresting you for criminal arson, for conspiracy to commit fraud, and for the willful contamination of public water sources. There will be additional charges as the investigation develops." He paused. "There may be murder charges. More than one." He said the last sentence quietly, without drama, but the crowd heard it, and the sound that moved through the gathered ranchers was not a cheer. It was something quieter and older than a cheer. A recognition. The particular release of people who have been carrying an injustice they could not name for a long time, finally hearing it named out loud. Brooks said nothing. Clancy cuffed him. Link sat on Zephyr and watched with a face that was utterly still, and Ziva did not look at the boy because she understood that this was a private thing and she was not going to take it from him by witnessing it too closely. She looked at the smoke rising from her land instead. Her barn was still there. Her house was still there. Daniel was still gone. But the man who had ordered it was in handcuffs at the end of a county bridge, and the papers her husband had died before he could obtain were in the hands of enough witnesses that they could not now be made to disappear. That was not everything, but it was not nothing. Link brought Zephyr alongside her. He said, "You really transmitted that on the radio." She said, "Before we came out of the barn." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "My dad would have liked you." She looked at him. She said, "I think your father was a brave man." Link nodded. He did not speak again. He did not need to. Behind them, across the plains, the first of the county water tankers was already moving toward the smoke. The fire took 2 days to fully die. It had burned 43 acres of Ziva's pasture land, destroyed 2 fence lines entirely, scorched the northern wall of the barn, and taken the old equipment shed that she had never repaired anyway. It had not taken the house. It had not taken the barn's main structure. It had not taken the horses. The neighbors came the same evening with water tanks and tools, and the particular competence of people who had fought grass fires before and understood that you did not wait for a perfect moment to help. The Drummond brothers worked the eastern perimeter through the night. The Vasquez women brought food and water and stayed to distribute it without being asked. The Abilene family brought a tractor and worked the firebreak lines until dawn. A dozen others she could not have named without checking her memory showed up, because they had heard her voice on the radio and understood what she had risked to use it. Clancy held Brooks at the county station overnight and made the call to the Federal Environmental Agency before midnight. He told her this the next morning when he came out to check on the situation, hat again in his hands, eyes carrying something that was either guilt or resolution or both. The federal investigators arrived from Cheyenne within 48 hours. The oilcloth package, the lab reports, the chemical analyses, the internal memos, Ray Calder's meticulous handwritten logs, went into evidence under a chain of custody that could not be broken. 3 company lawyers from Harlan Basin Mining appeared at the county station and were told to wait. The contamination of the southern aquifer had been ongoing for more than a decade. The environmental assessment that followed the initial federal review would eventually identify 17 properties whose water supply had been deliberately compromised, 11 of which had sold to Brooks Land Company at reduced prices in the years following the contamination. The financial recovery would take years, but it would come. The murder charges were filed within 6 weeks. Ray Calder's death was reclassified from industrial accident to homicide. The cable that had failed had been cut, partially, precisely, in a way that ensured it would hold under normal tension but snap under load. A technician who had since moved to Idaho was located and agreed to testify. He had been paid to do it and had spent 3 years not sleeping properly. The arson investigation into Daniel's death reopened. The insurance investigator who had originally filed the faulty wiring report was found to have received a payment from a Brooks-affiliated account 8 weeks after the fire. The official record was wrong. The record was corrected. It was not the same as having Daniel back. Nothing would be. But Ziva had stopped expecting resurrection years ago. What she had needed, and not known she needed, was the truth. The plain statement of what had actually happened, confirmed by evidence, entered into a permanent record. Her husband had been murdered. She had not imagined it. She had not been paranoid or unhinged or excessive in her grief. It had been real, and it had been intentional, and now the world would know it was real. She stood in the kitchen the afternoon after the federal agents left and held that fact inside her chest for a long moment. It was not comfort. It was something more solid than comfort, more lasting. Link was still on the couch, not because he had nowhere to go, the county would have placed him, but because she had not asked him to leave, and he had not offered to. On the third morning after the bridge, she came into the kitchen to find him at the table with a mug of coffee already made, having figured out where she kept things without being told. He had also, she noticed, fixed the latch on the root cellar door. She had not mentioned it. He had simply seen it was loose and done it. She sat across from him. She said, "There are papers I need to sign." He looked at her steadily. She said, "For guardianship, if you want." His hands tightened around the mug. She said, "Nobody is asking you to decide anything right now, but the offer doesn't expire." He looked down at the table. She watched him hold something. Grief, relief, the particular vulnerability of someone who had stopped expecting good things and was not certain how to receive them. He said, "I've never had a room that was mine." She said, "The room on the east side needs a coat of paint. You can pick the color." He looked up at her. His eyes were bright in a way he was trying not to show. She stood and picked up her coffee and went to the window and looked out at the burned land and the plain beyond it, where the morning light was doing what it always did, indifferent to what had happened, going on regardless. But if she looked carefully, at the very edge of the blackened ground where the irrigation water had reached the soil, green, a thin, tentative line of new growth along the channel's edge, barely visible. The kind of green that asked nothing and promised everything. She did not point it out to Link. He would see it on his own, in his own time. That was how it worked. 3 months later, Wyoming in December had a different quality of silence than Wyoming in September. The cold organized the landscape, stripped it of motion, left only the essential shapes, the ridgeline, the sky, the flat reach of the plains going in every direction. In the mornings, the frost made everything precise and temporary. By afternoon, when the sun came around, it softened things back into something less certain but warmer. The east pasture had been reseeded in October, after the soil testing came back from the University Extension and confirmed that the groundwater on Ziva's land, while historically affected by the basin contamination, had not been drawing from the most severely compromised aquifer sections. The well was clean, had always been, or had recovered. The geologist could not be certain which. Either way, the water was good. The barn's northern wall had been rebuilt by the first week of November. The Drummond brothers had brought lumber and not charged labor, and she had made food for 3 days and not charged that either, and they had parted with an understanding between them that required no formal accounting. The porch's eastern corner, the one that had sagged since the year after Daniel died, the one she had stopped noticing because there are things you stop noticing when they become permanent, had been repaired by Link in November, working from a how-to manual he had found in the shed and working until he got it right, which took him 2 weekends and 3 adjustments and produced a result that was level and solid and slightly better than the original. He was like that. He worked at things until they held. He was in school now in Harlan, enrolled late in the semester, behind in 2 subjects and ahead in 3. His math teacher had sent Ziva a note saying he had an unusual grasp of spatial reasoning and had she considered the county engineering scholarship. She had put the note on the refrigerator without comment and watched Link read it and try not to look like it meant anything to him. It meant something to him. The legal guardianship had been finalized in November. There was a paper in the county clerk's office that now said what was already true. Preston Brooks was in federal custody pending trial on charges that had grown, with each week of investigation, into something that would take years to fully prosecute. The contamination case alone involved 3 state agencies and 2 federal environmental authorities. The murder charges, Ray Calder, Daniel Holt, were state cases that the district attorney had agreed to try personally. Clancy had testified before the State Review Board about the structural compromises in his office's independence. He had offered his resignation twice. Both times the county commission had declined it, citing the circumstances of his cooperation and the community's preference that the office remain in his hands while the rebuilding occurred. He drove out to the ranch occasionally, not officially, and sat on the porch steps and drank coffee without saying much. She accepted this without comment. The legal title to Zephyr was transferred to Link by court order in December as part of the asset reparations from Brooks' estate. The document came through the mail on a Tuesday morning. Link read it at the kitchen table and set it down and stared at the wall for a long moment. He said, "He's mine." She said, "He was always yours." The paper just caught up. On a Friday afternoon in late December, she was sitting on the new porch in the low winter sun. The light came in at a long angle, gold going toward amber, the kind of December light that lasted only about an hour and made everything it touched look like it was being remembered rather than lived. Link came out of the house and sat on the step beside her. They were quiet together for a while. They were good at that. In the front pasture, the repaired one, the green one, the one that had come back, Zephyr was running. Not toward anything, not away from anything, just running in long, clean arcs across the restored grass, his dark body moving with that particular fluency that made watching him feel like being reminded of something you had forgotten about the world. That some things were made to move. That beauty was not ornamental. Link watched the horse run. After a while he said, "Do you think he knows?" She looked at him. He said, "That it's over. That he's free." She considered this for a moment. She said, "I think he knows the difference between a pasture with a gate and a stall with a lock. Whether he understands what happened in between." She watched Zephyr change direction at the far fence line, pivoting with impossible grace. She said, "Maybe he just knows this ground is his." Link nodded slowly. The sun was lower now. The amber was deepening toward the color of old wood, of a fire burning down to coals. The plains around them went in every direction, flat and wide and colder than they looked, and the sky above was the pale blue of winter at its most honest. No clouds, no ambiguity, just the plain fact of the sky going on. She thought about Daniel. She did this often. She thought she always would. She thought about his voice, which she had worked very hard over 11 years to preserve in her memory, the way you preserve something biological, carefully, in the right conditions, checking on it regularly to make sure it was still there. She thought about what he would have made of all of this. The boy on the porch, the horse in the pasture, the blackened ground turned green. She thought he would have said something simple and true. That was how he had been. He had believed in simple and true things with a ferocity that had infuriated her when they were young, and that she had spent 11 years understanding more completely. She did not say any of this out loud. It belonged to her, and she kept it. Link stood after a while and went in to start dinner without being asked. She heard him moving around in the kitchen, the particular sounds of competence being learned, the weight of the cast iron skillet, the rhythm of chopping, the click of the stove. She stayed on the porch. Zephyr had slowed to a trot now, moving along the far fence line, his breath visible in the cold air. The light was almost gone. She sat in it until it was. The fire can take the grass and the timber and the years of work laid down in fencing and seeding and the careful tending of things that do not come back quickly. It can take the structures you built with someone you loved. It can take the shape of the land you thought you knew. What it cannot take is what Ziva Holt carried through the smoke. The knowledge that truth, once witnessed, cannot be fully unmade. That a woman who refuses to hand over a frightened boy in the dark is already deciding something that will echo further than she knows. That a boy who rides through fire to protect his father's testimony becomes, in that riding, something his father would have recognized as worth everything it cost. There are men in this world who believe that fire is the final answer. That if you burn enough, you stop the question from being asked. They are wrong. The question was asked. It was heard on 93.7 on a Tuesday afternoon in Wyoming, over kitchen radios in 14 farmhouses across the southern county, by people who drove their trucks to a county bridge because the voice on the radio asked for help, and because they understood, even if they could not have explained it, that when truth asks for help you go. The plains grew back. The ranch was rebuilt. A boy found a home, and a horse found an open field, and a woman found, if not peace exactly, then the thing that grows in the ground where grief has been, something green, something that asks nothing, something that will be there in the morning. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something when Ziva opened that barn door, or when Link read his father's name in a federal court document, or when Zephyr ran free in the restored pasture, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? And what would you have done if you had been the one to find the boy in the barn? The answer matters. It says something about who you are.